Are Canadians really hating Indian nationals? What's changing and why it matters? In recent months, there has been growing tension in discussions between Canadians and Indian nationals, especially Indian students. Headlines report soaring student visa rejection rates, tougher immigration rules, and what many perceive as an unwelcoming climate. Are these signs of a new anti-Indian sentiment in Canada? If so, what is driving it? And is hate the right word? Or are we seeing policy shifts, political backlash, or systemic stress manifesting badly? In this essay, I argue that yes, there are elements of unfair treatment, rising resentment, and systemic bias, but also that much of what is blamed on hate is actually a mix of policy reaction, institutional capacity, and changing global student flows. Understanding this correctly is essential for Indian nationals, for Canada, and for how we think about migration, education, and belonging in a globalized world. What we do know, factual changes and data. Let's start with the hard evidence. What's changed? What policies are in effect, and what the metrics look like, especially regarding Indian students. From the Times of India article you provided. In 2025, Canada adopted what is described as its most restrictive student visa regime in a decade. The rejection rate for Indian student visa applications has jumped dramatically. Nearly 80% of Indian applications are now being rejected. Among changes, Canadian visa rules have tightened financial and language requirements. Applicants must show more substantial funds, have more rigorous study plans, and meet stricter language test standards. The Student Direct Stream, a program designed to expedite certain student visa approvals, has been shuttered. There has also been a reduction in the total planned number of study permits for 2025, about a 10% drop from the prior year. Indian students' enrollment numbers have declined sharply. For example, in 2024, Indian student admissions, or those gaining admission, were about 1.88 lakh, 188,000, which was barely half what they'd been 2 years before. Meanwhile, Germany has become more attractive. Its share of Indian students is rising, now leading in popularity. These are not just small tweaks. They represent major shifts in how reachable Canada is, or seems, for many Indian students, what might be causing the backlash or hardening of attitudes. To assess whether Canadians are hating Indian nationals, it helps to look at context. What pressures, fears, or political drivers exist in Canada that could explain both policy tightening and rising public resentment, if any. Here are some contributing factors. 1. Immigration and infrastructure strain. Canada has been facing challenges related to housing affordability, strain on public services, healthcare, transport, and infrastructure in regions with rapid population growth. There's increasing political pressure to ensure that newcomers don't overwhelm local systems. This creates a climate in which stricter immigration policies are more politically palatable. The article itself points to housing shortages, strained infrastructure, and growing political demands to prioritize local talent. 2. Domestic political pressure and populism. Immigration has become a point of contention in many Western countries. Canada is no exception. When voters feel that newcomers are competing unfairly for housing, jobs, or social services, political parties feel pressure to respond. That can lead to stricter standards, financial, language, etc., as an attempt to reassure the public. 3. Concerns about credential fraud, Bachausha's study plan, weakness policy, tightenings, study plans, proof of funds, language tests, often stem from fears about fraudulent applications, or students who enroll but do not genuinely intend to or are unable to succeed academically. Some of these concerns are legitimate, others may be exaggerated, but governments often err on the side of caution once a pattern is perceived. 4. Global mobility competition. As the article notes, as Canada becomes more restrictive, other countries, Germany especially, are becoming relatively more attractive. Students who once assumed Canada was a safe bet are looking elsewhere. That in turn may change Canadian institutions' incentives and contribute to public narrative. Why should we make it easier for foreign students if they can just go somewhere else? 5. Perceived cultural and social differences. Social media stories and anecdotal incidents can fuel perceptions among Canadians of misuse of student visas, underemployment, cultural isolation or mismatch, or even preferences in public discourse for local Canadians first. These perceptions, whether or not they reflect wider trends, can be amplified. Media framing and stereotypes. Media reports that highlight visa abuses, fraud, dropout rates, or misuse of immigration systems can shape popular attitudes, often in simplified or sensational ways. If the narrative becomes lots of Indian students, many misusing their visas, even truthful stories can lead to unfair generalization. Is this hate or something else? Hate is a strong word, suggesting animus, bias, perhaps racism or xenophobia. Are we seeing that? And is it justified to say Canadians are now hating Indian nationals? I think the answer is mixed. Here's how I break it down. There are instances of discrimination, xenophobic rhetoric, or prejudice, and some of that is directed at Indian nationals, students, immigrants. Anecdotally, things like social media backlash or local political speeches show elements of othering. But much of what we are seeing seems to be driven by structural and policy decisions rather than explicit hate. The tightening of visa regimes, increased financial thresholds, etc., can be understood as reactions to resource constraints, rising political pressure, and concerns about fairness. There is risk, however, that some of these policy shifts embed bias or disproportionately penalize people from certain countries, especially those from Global South countries, or those less able to meet financial or language requirements, even if talented. That may not be hate in the sense of direct ill will, but the outcomes can be very unfair or discriminatory. Also, when a large share, say 80% rejection, of a specific country's applicants starts being turned away, people will legitimately feel there is bias against them. Even if the policy is formally neutral, same rules for all, the real-world effect falls more heavily on some groups than others. That can become what many perceive as hate or bias. So, yes, I believe there is increasing resentment and some discriminatory attitudes, but the situation is not entirely reducible to hate. There's a complex interplay of policy, capacity, politics, and public perception. Why this matters: consequences. These shifts have real implications, including, for students and families. Many Indian students and their families invest heavily, financially, emotionally, in plans to study in Canada, with hopes of gaining good education, work experience, perhaps eventual residency. When visa rejections rise, many of those plans unwind. That's a big disappointment, and for some, a grave injustice if they were playing by the rules. For Canadian institutions, universities and colleges often rely on international student tuition revenue. Sharp declines in enrollments can hit budgets, especially in smaller colleges. Some may struggle or close. Quality of education, diversity, and global connections can suffer. For Canada's global reputation, being seen as unwelcoming or closing doors to certain nationalities diminishes Canada's image as a multicultural, immigrant-friendly country. That can have diplomatic, economic, and soft power costs. For migration and equity, stricter rules may disproportionately affect lower-income applicants from India or elsewhere who cannot show huge funds or high language test scores but may be otherwise capable. For alternative destinations, as India's students choose Germany and other countries, those countries could benefit not just in enrollments, but in talent retention. Canada may lose out on long-term economic, social, intellectual contributions. Why some claims of hate may be overstated or misguided. To keep the analysis balanced, there are reasons to believe claims that Canadians are hating Indians may overread the situation or misattribute causes. Policy versus prejudice. As mentioned, many changes are policy responses to legitimate concerns about capacity or to broader immigration issues. Some may feel unfair, but that's different than motivated hatred. Selective reporting. Media and social media tend to amplify stories that confirm suspicion, so a handful of bad incidents can seem representative, even if they are not. Public opinion is mixed. Not all Canadians support stricter immigration or express negative views. There remain many who are supportive of international students and immigration more broadly. The hardening of attitudes might be strong in some segments, political, older, or in areas under urban strain, but is not universal. International student policy is global, not just Canadian. Canada's tightening is part of a global trend. Other countries are also raising standards or becoming stricter in student visas or migration because of public pressure, backlash, or concerns over system abuse. So some of what looks like targeting is just part of broader global recalibration. Germany becoming more popular is part of that shift. My interpretation: are Canadians now hating Indians? Putting this all together, here's what I think. Canadians are not monolithic. There is no single unified hate movement, but there is a growing undercurrent of resentment or concern about immigration study permits from certain countries, including India. The policy changes suggest a shift from more open, welcoming student visa policies toward more selective, restrictive ones. That may stem from perceived overuse, misuse, or unsustainable scale rather than explicit racial animus. But the effect is that many Indian students are now hitting the wall in ways they did not expect. Some degree of public backlash or prejudice no doubt exists. When communities see large numbers of foreign students, there are often complaints, real or perceived, about competition for jobs, housing, etc., that sometimes morphs into more overt xenophobia or othering in discourse. But the situation is not as simple as Canadians hate Indians. Many Canadians likely see the visa restrictions as reasonable, necessary, or even overdue. The policies have explicit stated aims, infrastructure, prioritizing locals, which resonate with segments of the population. What needs to happen if Canada wants to do better? If Canada and Canadians want to avoid drifting into unfair discrimination or the appearance of animus, here are what I believe are important steps. 1. Transparency in policy. The government should clearly publish data. What are rejection reasons, broken down by country, institution, program, etc.? Are rejections because of fraud, weak study plans, lack of financial proof, language insufficiency, or something else? Detailed transparency helps avoid suspicion and builds trust. 2. Support for genuine students. For students who are well-intentioned and meet standards, or could with help. There should be support, better access to preparatory resources, clearer guidance, perhaps partner programs that help students meet financial/language standards so that they are not disadvantaged purely by economic background. 3. Balanced public discourse. Politicians, media, educational institutions should avoid using language that scapegoats or generalizes. We should distinguish policy concerns from people concerns. Avoid framing all students from any nationality as problems. 4. Monitoring and anti-discrimination protections. If some visa officers or institutional policies are unfairly applying rules more harshly to certain nationalities, there should be mechanisms to complain, review, and rectify. Oversight and fairness are essential. International Student Strategy Canada should calibrate its international student strategy not just toward revenue, but toward inclusion, quality of experience, and post-graduation pathways. If students feel Canada is a dead end or a trap, damage to reputation is severe. Conclusion: the path forward. In sum, yes, there is reason to believe that Indian nationals, especially students, are facing increasingly harsh treatment under Canadian student visa policies. That there is growing public concern and sometimes resentment, and that some degree of perceived unfairness is real. Whether one calls it hate depends on how you define that word. If it implies hate speech, systematic racial targeting, etc., then the evidence is not uniformly pointing there, yet. But there is a danger. These policies and attitudes risk sliding into discrimination if not checked. Canada has built much of its identity around multiculturalism, immigration, and global openness. Tightening borders and visa rules are understandable in an era of constrained resources, but they must be implemented with fairness, clarity, and respect. For Indian students looking abroad, these changes are a warning. Canada is no longer the default choice it once was. For Canadians, this is a moment to reflect. Is the country we want one that closes doors to earnest young people simply because of nationality or financial status? The decisions made now will shape not just the numbers of international students, but the soul of Canada's openness. Please leave your thought and comments below, and remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel for more thought-provoking topics.